Chapter 43, The Enchanted Ground. They came, a little later in the day, to that part of the plain which was called the Enchanted Ground. It was a very pleasant place, so sheltered by the hills that the air was always soft and warm. The streams flowed gently along, the breeze scarcely stirred in the leaves of the trees, and everything around them seemed quiet and happy. But the meadows on either side of the Way of the King were not fenced in like those in the beautiful Valley of Peace. Therefore, it was not safe for pilgrims to lie down and rest in them. The servants of the wicked prince were often hidden among the rocks and bushes, and when travelers were foolish enough to sleep there, they were almost sure to be robbed, if they were not carried away altogether. "Oh dear," exclaimed Hopeful presently, "I am so sleepy. My eyes keep shutting every minute. Do let us sit down and rest a little while." "Not here," said Christian, and he seized Hopeful's arm and shook him gently. "Hopeful, Hopeful, you're forgetting this is Enchanted Ground." "Well," replied Hopeful drowsily, "there is no one to hurt us. I'll only stay a few minutes, Christian. Don't wait for me." He threw himself down upon the grass, but Christian quickly pulled him up again, and this time he shook him violently. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Don't you remember what the shepherds told us?" And he did not rest until Hopeful was thoroughly awakened. Then the little pilgrim was frightened at the thought of his danger. "What should I have done if I had been alone? I am sure I would have fallen asleep. I never felt so tired in all my life." "I was just beginning to feel sleepy too," replied Christian, "but shaking you roused me up. We may be very thankful that we are together. Let us talk about something interesting. That will keep us awake. You have never told me how it was that you began to be a pilgrim." "I started before you did," said Hopeful. "I knew Faithful very well, and when First Evangelist talked to him, he used to come to me afterwards and tell me what he had heard about the king. I did not care much then, but after a time I thought it would be nice to live in the celestial city. So one day I ran off to the wicket gate and began my journey. But when I came to Vanity Fair, I stopped to play with the boys in the streets, and at last they persuaded me not to go any further, so I stayed there." "You didn't like it really, did you?" "No, at least I liked it sometimes, but I used often to feel frightened and unhappy. When pilgrims passed through the town, I was ashamed and afraid lest they should see me. Then you came with Faithful, and the minute I saw him, I knew who he was." "Did you see us beaten?" asked Christian. "Yes, and I watched you when you were in the cage. Once I crept close up to the bars. I think you must have been asleep, but Faithful saw me, and he spoke to me." "What did he say?" "He begged me to leave the city at once, and he said the king would forgive me for our dear prince's sake. Then I saw all that dreadful sight, and I knew that Faithful had suffered patiently because he loved the king, and I made up my mind that, when you were set free, I would ask you to let me go with you." "I am so glad you did," said Christian. "We've been very happy together. Don't you feel glad too?" "Yes," replied Hopeful. "Indeed I do. I am sure now that the king loves me, and it will not be very long before we are both safe in his beautiful city." Chapter 44, The Little Pilgrims Wait for Ignorance. All this time, Ignorance had been traveling slowly along by himself. The Flatterer and Unbelief never took any notice of him, because they knew he had not begun his pilgrimage in the right way, and that when he reached the celestial city, the king's servants would not allow him to enter its gates, but would send him back to his own master, the wicked prince. So Ignorance met with no trouble or difficulty, and did not even feel sleepy when he crossed the Enchanted Ground. While Hopeful and little Christian were passing over that dangerous plain, they remembered Ignorance and wondered how he was getting on. Presently Hopeful looked back. "He's only a little way behind us. Shall we wait for him?" "Perhaps it would be better," replied Christian. "Then, if he feels sleepy, we can keep him awake." The little pilgrims waited, but although Ignorance saw that they were standing still, he did not seem to care about overtaking them. "It is a pity for you to stay behind," said Christian, as the lad came slowly towards him. "Won't you walk with us?" "I don't care," replied Ignorance. "I would just as soon walk by myself. I've always so much to think about." What is it that you think about? Asked Hopeful. The king and the celestial city. But thinking about them is not enough, said Christian. We ought to be very anxious to see the king and his city. So I am. Then why don't you travel faster? I'm traveling quite fast enough. I am sure that I shall reach the city some day, and why should I not take my journey comfortably? But perhaps, if you are so careless about it, you will fall into trouble or danger. Well, if I do, the king will help me. The king will not help you if you do not try to obey him, said Hopeful, who felt sure that Ignorance did not really know much about the king and his laws. I do try to obey him, answered the boy. I have left my home and become a pilgrim. What else can I do? You did not pass by the cross, said Christian, and I'm afraid that if you have not a roll in a pilgrim's dress, the king's servants will not let you enter the city. I am sure you're quite wrong in that, replied Ignorance. I have read that the prince will give a white robe to every pilgrim, and no doubt he will send me mine soon. Why should I travel to the wicket gate and the cross to look for it? It would seem as if I did not believe what the prince had said. Then Christian remembered the paper which Evangelist had given to him before he left home. Perhaps Ignorance had one like it. Did the king send you a message? He asked. A message? No, of course he did not. I should never expect a great king to send a message to a boy like me. Poor little Christian felt quite puzzled. I don't know what to say to him, he whispered to Hopeful. I am sure he's wrong, but he will not believe us. But Ignorance was now tired of talking. I really can't keep up with you, he said. You must go on by yourselves. And as the little pilgrims did not know what else they could say to him, they went on and left him to follow as slowly as he wished. Chapter 45, The Land of Delight. The little pilgrims, having passed over the Enchanted Ground, found themselves in the Land of Delight. It was the most beautiful country they'd ever seen. Its mountains were covered with trees, and its valleys were green with soft grass and bright with the loveliest flowers. In the distance shone the glorious light which the shepherds had shown them from the delectable mountains, and as the children's eyes grew accustomed to its brightness, they were able to distinguish the walls and the gates of the celestial city. The wicked prince and his soldiers never came into the Land of Delight. The people who lived there were all true servants of the king, and they received Christian and Hopeful very kindly. Your troubles are over now, they said. You have only to stay here and be happy until the king sends for you. Will he send soon? Asked Christian. We cannot tell you that, replied the people. Sometimes the pilgrims live quietly in this land for many years, and sometimes the king gives them work to do for him in the country of the wicked prince. But at last they all go to the celestial city to dwell forever in his presence. I remember, said Christian, when Help drew me out of the slough, he said that he had been to the gates of the city, but the king had given him some work which he would have to do before he entered. And while he wandered up and down the mountains and along the beautiful valleys with Hopeful, little Christian began to wonder whether his mother was living in this Land of Delight, or whether she had gone into the city. He looked anxiously at the people whom he met, but he did not see anyone whose face was like his mother's picture. The king must have sent for her, he said. Oh, will it not be nice to see her again? Perhaps she has heard that we are here, and she may be watching for us even now. The little pilgrims spent many happy days in the Land of Delight, and one morning they came to a valley which was laid out in vineyards and large gardens. The gates were all wide open, and as the boys stopped to look at the trees and flowers on one of the gardeners spoke to them. You need not stay outside, he said. These are the king's gardens, and they are for pilgrims to walk in. Then he took their hands and led them about among the vines and flowers, and in the evening he showed them a quiet little arbor where they might lie down and sleep safely. Oh, said Christian, as they sat watching the sun, which was slowly sinking beyond the hills, don't you feel glad that we came? I seem to be forgetting all the troubles we have had, now that we are so happy. I am so thankful that I ran away from Vanity Fair, said Hopeful, and it was such a good thing that I did not lose my roll there. I don't know how it was that I managed to keep it safely. And now we have only to wait for the king's message, continued Christian. I would like I would go away and work if he wished it, but I think I would like best to go straight to the city." "So would I," said Hopeful. And then they lay down side by side, as they had done in the Valley of Peace, and slept quietly until the morning.